Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical facts and insights. An old fact about me, I am a devoted rail fan. That is, a fan of railroads, as you can probably tell by the name. And as such, I have devoted much of my life to the study of vehicles that run on rails. And I know what you're thinking, Luke, haven't you already done an episode on the history of railroads? Well, yes, but I figured it would be a good time to discuss the history of railroads that run in town centers and city squares, and that, of course, is the history of streetcar lines. And when I say streetcars, I do not only mean trolleys. The term trolley applies to a motorized streetcar with a pole attached to it that runs to a power line from which the trolley gets its electricity. The term streetcar also applies to cable cars and trams. So join me, as it is a beautiful day in the neighborhood, to discuss the history of streetcars. And yes, that was a Mr. Rogers reference. Sue me. Actually, no, don't. I don't want to be sued. Now, before we can dive into the history of streetcar lines, I must first tell you about the first mass transportation vehicle in America. It was called an omnibus. It resembled a stagecoach and was pulled by horses. And the first omnibus to operate in America began running up Broadway Street in Abraham Brower. He also organized the first fire department in New York City. A long-drawn carriage in America to take people to their designations. What was new and different about the omnibus, however, was that it ran along a certain designated route, charged a very low fare. People on would wave their hands in the air. The driver, who sat on a bench on the top of the omnibus at the front, much like a stagecoach driver. And when people who were riding inside wanted to get off the omnibus, they pulled a little leather strap. The leather strap was connected to the ankle of the person who was driving the omnibus. And horse-drawn omnibuses ran in American cities from 1826 until about 1905. So roughly almost 80 years, which is pretty good, I must say. The big major improvement in the omnibus system happened in 1832 when the first streetcar service began and ran along Bowery Street in New York City. It was owned by a man named John Mason, who was a wealthy banker, and built by an Irishman named John Stephenson. Stephenson's New York company would become the largest and most famous builder of horse-drawn streetcars. New Orleans, Louisiana became the second major city to offer streetcar systems in 1835. The typical American streetcar was operated by two crew members. One man, the driver, rode up front. His job was to drive the horse, as these streetcars were pulled by horses at the time, controlled by a set of reins. The driver also held a brake handle that could be used to stop the streetcar. When streetcars got bigger, sometimes 2 and 3 horses would be used to haul a single car. The second crew member was the conductor, who rode at the back of the car. His job was to help passengers get on and off the streetcar and to collect fares. He gave the driver a signal when everyone was on board, and it was safe to proceed, pulling on a rope that was attached to a bell that the driver could hear at the other end of the car. And of course, in the 1860s, the time of the Industrial Revolution, people were trying to replace horse-drawn streetcars. One of the first ways to do it was, of course, through means of electricity. In 1834, a blacksmith from Brandon, Vermont, named Thomas Davenport, built a small battery-powered electric motor and used it to operate a small car on a short section of track. In 1860, another American named G.F. Train operated 3 lines in London and 1 line in Birkenhead, England. The system ways in Britain and was established at Salford and Liverpool in 1862 and 1865 respectively. However, the first major attempt to develop a machine that could replace horses on streetcar lines did not happen really until 1873. It was then that a man named Andrew Halliday introduced the cable car system. And these cars were driven by endless cable running in a slot between the rails and passing over a steam-driven shaft in the powerhouse. The system was well adapted for operation on steep hills and reached its most extensive use in San Francisco and Seattle. And in these cities, some streetcar lines were converted to cable cars. Converting streetcar lines from horse cars to cable cars required digging a ditch between the rails and building a chamber from one end of the line to the other. This chamber was called a vault, and when the vault was finished, a small opening was left at the top. A long cable was placed inside the vault. The cable ran under the city streets from one end of the streetcar line to the other. The cable was spliced into a big loop and was kept moving by a huge steam engine, as I said, with massive wheels and pulleys located in a powerhouse at the side of the street. The cable cars themselves were equipped with a device that extended down below the car into the vault and allowed an operator of the car to latch on to the moving cable when he wanted the car to go. He could release the cable when he wanted the car to stop. There were many pulleys and wheels inside the vault to make sure the cable was able to go around corners as well as up and down hills. Although the first cable cars ran in San Francisco, the largest and busiest of the cable cars was in Chicago. Most large American cities had one or more cable car lines by 1890. Cable cars operated more smoothly than early streetcars, but they came with their own set of problems. They could only run at a consistent speed, and if the cable broke or got jammed, all cars were tied up on the line. Beginning about 1800, most cable trackage was replaced by electric cars. But the Seattle lines lasted until the 1930s, and a portion of the San Francisco system remains today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That is not to say, however, that horses did not have their own problems. They certainly did. Several were needed to maintain regular interrupted service, each at a time, cost between $125 and $200, and they required at least 30 pounds of hay and grain, and their life expectancy was relatively short. Some companies utilized what were called steam dummies. They were small locomotives intended for light, density, rapid transit use. However, the contraptions produced much soot and debris, much like their larger counterparts. An important milestone in electric locomotive history would come about in 1860, when an Italian man named Antonio Panicotti developed the continuous current dynamo. His work eventually led to a German man named Zenobie Graham's invention of the generator in 1870, which could be used in commercial applications. And with these refinements, another German named Werner von Siemens demonstrated a small electric locomotive in Berlin, Germany in 1879. It used a third rail system, which is, as you can probably guess, a third rail next to the two rail tracks through which electricity is supplied to the locomotive. And it hauled 20 people at about 8 miles per hour on a 0.3 mile segment of track. And back in America, Thomas Edison tested a small dynamo-driven electric locomotive in around his lab in Menlo Park, New Jersey in 1880, but he never took the concept further. What could be termed the first successful application of electric rail cars for streetcar service happened in 1883 by two different men, Leo Daft in Greenville, New Jersey, and Charles J. Van Deppele in Chicago. Daft carried out trials in several other cities, such as Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City. By 1887 to 1888, he had redefined his system to the point cars achieved power via a four-wheel truck which ran along an overhead wire pulled by a cable. And these were called troller cars and were later mistakenly called trolleys, and this became the ubiquitous nickname for streetcars. However, it should be noted that the term trolley can only be applied to streetcars that are electrically powered, obviously, and have a trolley pole and a trolley wheel, which is how the electric motor receives its electricity. And actually, I think it is pronounced Vanderpool. Vanderpool's system enjoyed much widespread use, which employed a front-mounted pole trolley. It later found service in cities like Minneapolis, Minnesota, Wheeling, South Bend, Indiana, and even parts of Canada. The modern streetcar, from which the later interurban movements blossomed, is credited to a man named Frank Sprague, a U.S. naval officer who had graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1878. After his time in service, he worked with a pioneer in battery car technology, Professor Moses Farmer, and later apprenticed under Thomas Edison developing electric lights. Feeling confident in his abilities, he founded the Sprague Electric Railway and Motor Company in 1885 and went on to produce a reliable 500-volt DC motor. In 1886, he mounted it within a car for the New York Elevated Railway, whereby the motors were situated between the axle along with the trolley pole and multiple unit control stand. This gave way to the trolley, which became a common sight throughout the United States. However, Sprague failed to interest the New York Elevated, but others were impressed. He eventually secured a contract in May of 1887 with the Richmond Union Passenger Railway in Richmond, Virginia, to provide cars for transportation. It opened on February 2, 1888, and proved to be a phenomenal success. With his single invention, electrified streetcars and trolleys were rapidly laid down throughout the United States. By 1902, at least 15,000 miles were in service across the country. The northeastern United States contained the densest network of local trolley carriers. This also saw the rise of the interurban system. And while the definitions and distinctions between streetcars and interurbans have always been hazy, the Northeast boasted what are considered true trolleys. That is to say, they were local in nature and served only one urban center, and virtually all lines were situated within the street. Now, interurban systems, on the other hand, connected more than one town, and their rights-of-way often ran either alongside a local country road or were privately owned. Massachusetts, for example, contained some 3,000 miles of streetcar trackage, earning the distinction as being the only state to have more electrified railroads than traditional steam-powered lines. The old saying goes that all good things must come to an end, and the age of the streetcars was no exception. During the First World War, streetcar enterprisers encountered much financial difficulty. As wage and materials costs rose, the companies were squeezed by fixed fares set almost universally by the municipal franchises. By government action permitted fare raises, but by then the use of automobiles had spread, and many cities had shifted to motor bus systems. The direct operating expenses of the bus per mile were greater than those of streetcars, but the heavy expenses of track construction and maintenance ultimately rendered streetcars uneconomical. Streetcars began to be replaced by automobiles and buses in the 1930s. This trend accelerated during the 40s and 50s. Across the pond in Great Britain, the substitution of buses for trams was hastened during the 1930s by the development of improved double-decker buses, and by the early 1950s there were no trams left running in London. The last major British train system was that of Glasgow, Scotland, which employed relatively modern double-decker cars. Paris closed the last of its streetcar lines in the 1930s, and in other parts of Paris and Italy, many cities shifted to bus operation. However, there are still many major streetcar systems in operation, with many cities building new systems beginning in the late 20th century. Streetcar systems today are largely municipal, with private bus companies not permitted. In the 1980s, some cities in the United States began adopting light rail transit. The trackage for this modern electric trolley system was less expensive to construct than that for elevated or underground metropolitan train systems. Light rail systems were constructed in such American cities as San Diego, California, Sacramento, California, and San Jose, California, Portland, Oregon, and Buffalo, New York. In the early 21st century, increased traffic congestion and the need to revive downtown areas led to interest in the streetcar, with systems being built in some American cities such as Houston, Texas, Tampa, Florida, and Washington, D.C. And Kansas City, Missouri still has an active streetcar line. And with that, folks, I'm afraid I have to wrap up this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, because Lord knows I've enjoyed making it. I think that we've learned that just because something loses popularity during one time means that it can also gain popularity during another time. I mean, to this day, we still have some streetcar lines here in the United States. And I know of several states in the Northeast that have trolley museums, and they still offer trolley rides. With that, I say goodbye, and God bless.